Hello and welcome everyone to today's lunchtime event, the Corporate Diversity Jigsaw. This event is brought to you by the UCL Centre for Ethics and Law. My name is Iris Chu and I'm Director of the Centre. I'm chairing today's proceedings and I'll briefly introduce the speakers as well as today's proceedings. First, my speaker today is Dr. Akshaya Kalmanath, Senior Lecturer at the Australian National University. Dr. Kalmanath has degrees from the US, Australia, and India, and today's talk is based on a chapter in her forthcoming book to be published by the Cambridge University Press. Dr. Kalmanath will speak for about 20 minutes, following which I'll invite Professor Ari Marie Esser to comment. Professor Esser is Professor of Corporate Law and Governance at the University of Glasgow. She has written extensively on many aspects of corporate law and governance, and her work has been referenced and followed in the King 4 report on corporate governance in South Africa. Professor Esser will provide comments for about 15 minutes, and after that, I'll invite questions and comments from the audience. I'll moderate the Q&A session and will field to our speakers the questions that you may wish to pose. Please take this opportunity throughout the duration of our presentations to ask live questions over the Q&A function. So without further ado, let me now invite Akshaya to take the floor.
Thank you, Iris. Hi, everyone. I think I'll start with giving a little introduction about the book before getting into the chapter. So as the title suggests, it's I call it the Corporate Diversity Jigsaw for a reason. So I've been working on issues of diversity on the board and on other levels of the corporation for a while. And I've noticed that we keep talking about some aspects of diversity, but a lot of other aspects are rarely part of the not just the academic conversation, but also the policy discussion out there. So it felt like we're looking at few pieces in the diversity jigsaw and not really seeing the whole picture. And this is resulting in law and regulations and policies that may have unintended consequences. And those are the sorts of things that I deal with in the chapter that I plan to discuss in more detail today. But just before getting into that chapter, just to give the structure of the book, and that'll tell you where this chapter fits. So I start with the first chapter is about defining diversity. And I felt that this is one of the pieces in the diversity jigsaw that needs more explanation and more thinking about, because mostly we're talking about some facets of diversity like gender, in recent times race, but not so much other facets. And there could be many. So diversity in terms of age, experience, different cognitive abilities, or viewpoints, as they say in the US. So once I describe different facets to diversity, I look at its relevance at various levels in the corporation. And moving to chapter 2, I focus specifically on diversity and its value in corporate governance. So this chapter looks at the board and the management, and we talk about board diversity a lot. So I expand that discussion to other facets of diversity on the board, and also focus the discussion on diversity at the managerial level in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, I look at diversity from the perspective of social movements, specifically Me Too and Black Lives Matter, that have become really the catalyst for some more recent policy changes on diversity. But in chapter 3, I'm looking more at how corporations respond to these social movements, not really what the legislator or policy discussion is, but the social movements that have gained traction on social media. So there are different type of social movement now as compared to previous social movements, because they're supercharged, so to say, because of social media, and corporations have to react very quickly. And so chapter 3 talks about how corporations need to be thinking more long term about this, rather than react in uh, rather than have knee jerk reactions to some big social media storm that they think they need, that they see it as needing to put out a fire at the moment. And then chapter 4, which is what I want to talk more about today, is about the different legal and market initiatives we have across jurisdictions to increase diversity in the corporation. And I won't say more, I'll come back to it. But chapter 5, I move on to talk about this idea of corporate culture that we've been talking about. It's not something that's not spoken about, but I think we don't really bring it into the diversity conversation enough. If we need to talk about diversity in the long term, I think corporate culture needs to be part of that story. So that's what chapter 5 is about. And then I go to chapter 6 and do the opposite of what most academic books are supposed to do. Usually they start with a chapter on the theories. So I do that at the end of the book because I wanted the chapters to be free of uh, one theory or the other. So if I play my cards about which theory I favor at the beginning, then I'll be kind of wedded to that in my entire discussion on diversity. So I decided to keep that till the end. And in chapter 6, I talk about the different theories, how it affects our view and conversation about diversity. But ultimately, uh, I conclude in chapter 6 that the different theories are not that far apart, even though it looks like they're really at loggerheads. But let me go back now to chapter 4 and talk about my argument about how we're regulating diversity. So across jurisdictions, we seem to have um, two different tools in the playbook. Basically, either you have mandatory quotas or you have disclosure mechanisms. And broadly, my argument in chapter 4 is that both quotas and disclosure measures, and I'll talk more about uh, the type of disclosure measures, but for now, more generally, quotas and disclosure measures, I think, have end up having more costs than benefits. And I'll go over what benefits we're trying to get out of these sorts of laws, and then what costs they're creating. So to talk about quotas first, we've seen them start in Europe. So Norway was known as this country that started talking about diversity first, but in my book I talk about how that's not actually true. This conversation was on even before 2003, when Norway had its first legislation for quota legislation. But I think Norway is really it underscores the conversation, because since 2003, when it came out with its legislation about mandating a certain percentage of directors on the board needing to be women, that became a talking point. And many countries, it even had what some call the snowball effect. It's even had repercussions across countries, and different countries started to look towards Norway and thinking about how to enact quotas in this regard, especially where I'm from, India. Out of almost nowhere, a quota legislation came up a little after the Norway legislation, so it had wide-reaching impacts. But to talk about what benefits we're trying to get out of it, I start with Norway, but literally every other country that's legislating in one form or the other mentions similar things in the policy discussion when they're talking about the rationale for such a law. So they talk about business benefits, which I kind of don't really endorse through the book, because by business benefits, what is being referred to is a number of empirical studies that, and these are kind of selectively chosen, but basically empirical studies that say that women directors or other types of diverse directors, mostly it's gender or race, result in better firm performance. And a number of these studies don't really show what is this diversity on the board actually resulting in causation, or was it just correlation. But there are studies that try and find different variables that could have caused it. But mostly, I feel that there are also studies providing the contrary result, and those are not quoted. So I don't take these arguments very seriously. So leaving that possible benefit aside, I think we can think of other benefits that policymakers talk about, and one of the big ones is having a trickle down impact on management positions and the rest of the company. That is to say, you'll have increased numbers of women or other diverse candidates if you just mandate diversity at the board level. So going back to Norway, one of the criticisms that came out of the quota law there is that it resulted in quickly appointing the same few women directors across different company boards, and these were known as the golden skirts. So it didn't even increase the number of women at the board level. But of course, the counter argument is that this is something they had to do to quickly respond to the law. So over time, it could increase. But there were also studies to show that it didn't really have the kind of trickle down effect that we were looking for. It didn't increase the number of women directors across different uh, levels in the corporation. The other benefit I like to talk about, and I think that's a valid benefit, is the role model impact of having women directors on the board, not just role models to society, but even within the corporation. People, other women or diverse candidates within the workforce can see that this is a possibility in their career path at that firm. So there is that I'll say is good about if you can achieve better representation through quotas. But in terms of costs, one big cost that people talk about is tokenism, that is appointing women directors or diverse candidates on the board, irrespective of their qualifications or whether you would appoint this person otherwise. But I think there's an added thing there. Even if you are appointing very qualified members who are women or diverse candidates, but you're doing this after or in response to a law, it tends to be there is a kind of stigma attached to such appointments. So I feel that the costs are borne by those very diverse candidates we're trying to help. Um, Also, I think apart from all of this, I think the big problem is that quotas don't bring about a cultural change in the firm. So we're talking about trickle down effects in terms of numbers, but I usually uh, I don't like the focus on numbers so much, because we want to see whether this is sustainable even without a quota. Have we changed the culture through the law that the company will normally start hiring diverse candidates? And this kind of flows into why I think disclosure measures are similarly problematic. Because of this focus on numbers. So disclosure measures across most jurisdictions, um, I think the UK Corporate Governance Code does not focus on numbers. It doesn't say you need 30% or 40%. So that's something that I describe very positively, because the UK Corporate Governance Code and also the US, the older SEC rule that is still in place. So the SEC rule in the US simply asks for disclosing, if you have a diversity policy, disclose it and mention what impact, explain what impact it's having. So both these sorts of measures, I think I wouldn't say are having the same costs as quotas, like I started in my earlier argument. But the type of disclosure laws I'm trying to say have the same costs are those that actually have a soft target, although you're simply saying you need to disclose the number of women or diverse candidates on the board, you are aiming for, like the California and the NASDAQ rules recently introduced, they specify if you have a 9-member board, you need to have at least 3 diverse candidates. If you have a 5-member board, you need to have at least 2 diverse candidates. And even the UK Corporate Governance Code, even though it doesn't mention numbers, you had these reports, the Davis report, Parker Review, etc., that actually exhort companies to meet certain numerical targets. So these are all informal and soft, and yet the moment you have the focus on numbers, companies respond by either making token appointments or appointing, even if they're qualified, all the things I mentioned early on, earlier comes to be. So the same costs as we have with quotas, because there's a focus on numbers. Also, when companies are expending resources on focusing on whether they have the numbers so that they can disclose those numbers and look good, they are then not taking away resources from other efforts, firm specific efforts that they could be making to bring about cultural shifts, and to bring about change that their specific firm actually requires. So in my argument, when I say that I'm opposed to both types of things that we have so far, quotas and disclosure mechanisms, I'm not saying that we need to do nothing about it. My argument is to encourage or incentivize firms to look into what problems their workforce specifically faces. So many firms have started when there is a big problem, like in the context of Uber, when there was something that a public relations, it becomes a public relations issue, then they appoint someone to do an external consultant to do a review of the firm, etc. But you could be working on these things ex ante before there are major problems, and doing surveys of your employees regularly, figuring out if you have attrition of diverse candidates at a certain level of the workforce, figuring out why through exit interviews, and then working through those issues within the firm. And I think if we need to incentivize that sort of long-term thinking from a policy perspective, we should walk back from this focus on numerical targets and instead encourage qualitative disclosures. And I think now the market already has enough of these Glassdoor and those sort of Comparably is another company where you can review the company you're working in, and prospective employees will look at it and decide whether they want to join based on what they see there. And now I was talking about the third chapter focusing on social movements. So in that chapter, I discuss how employees sometimes come out and say that our firm says that they have met these diversity targets, and yet there are 1, 2, 3 problems faced by Black employees in our firm. So there are these sort of ways in which information comes out of the firm. And so it's more and more important for firms to innovate ways in which they can address diversity issues, and they can do that if they focus on the problems that their specific workforce in their specific sector have, rather than trying to look at the industry standard and following a check the box approach to just complying with what the bare minimum is required. So I think that's my 20 minutes. I'll stop there, but I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Akshaya, for your talk. Very, very interesting observations on the limitations of legal mechanisms. But yet again, I mean, we may question whether or not we still need some law as a basic building block in order to kickstart change. With that, can I invite Irene Marie to comment?
Yes, thank you so much, Iris, and thank you also for the interesting presentation. I really enjoyed that. I also read most of your book. I have to say I really enjoyed chapter 1 on the definitions, and also, of course, chapter 4 and 5 on the culture shift. So thank you so much for that. So maybe just a few points from my side on based on what you've said today, and also what I've read with regards to chapter 4 specifically. So for me, the main contribution of the book is that it attempts to move away from the largely focused on topics that you've mentioned before, namely how to increase women on boards, the business case for board diversity, what is the best way to regulate it, if at all, and looking at the link between diverse boards and firm performance. So moving from those topics to a different approach of favoring what is termed in the book firm-specific solutions. So it is stated at the start of your book that a more compassionate and empathetic model of corporate governance is called for. And I found that quite interesting because corporate governance and the word empathetic, it's not often used in the same sentence. So linking that to your firm-specific solutions, I found interesting. So you then use a metaphor of a jigsaw in the book to look at the various pieces of diversity and how it all fits together. It is then specifically stated that there is no easy legal solution, even if we try to find these missing pieces. And as you said at the start of your talk today, chapter 4 is the chapter which is under discussion today, and that chapter really focuses on the legal landscape, and that is what I will also deal with in the next 10 to 12 minutes. It is perhaps interesting to start with some myths in the context of board diversity. And I found an interesting study by Professor Bosch in the South African context, where she debunks certain myths in this context. This is, of course, done in the context of South African companies, but it still provides some useful background to some of the points I would like to raise today, and some of the points that's also dealt with in the book. It is stated that it is a myth that there is not a sufficient pool of women available to serve. Another myth is that all women support targets. And then it is stated that this is not true, as a lot of women want to actually resist this notion because they don't want to be seen as a token appointment. And you've mentioned that, of course, in the context of what you term costs of regulation. Another myth is that if we leave things as they are, there will be a natural increase in the numbers of women on boards. In this study, they then refer to the fact that South African companies do not always meet diversity requirements, and that not all boards are, of course, diverse. And they link that to that working in or working with specific networks that we know is a probable reason for this, as we don't deliberately try to broaden our networks and meet other people and collaborate with them. So this links quite well for me with some of the arguments made in the book on the culture of a corporation and how to deal with diversity internally. Be that as it may, I would like to focus on 4 specific issues today, because there's so much written on diversity, and there's so many arguments for diversity, against diversity, for regulation, against regulation, counter arguments, that I find it easier to sort of divide this into 4 areas and then try to deal with it in that way. So the first one is regulation that I would like to focus on. Secondly, the role of corporate culture in this context. Then the link with independence. And then finally, the distinction between public and private companies. So as explained before, the UK follows a soft law approach to ensuring gender diverse boards, coupled with some hard law disclosure requirements for certain types of companies. This is different to some other countries following a mandatory approach with quotas in place. My view is that some form of regulation is needed to ensure diverse boards, but this should be linked to 2 equally important issues. First, corporate culture, and secondly, how we define diversity. So for me, a combination of regulation in the form of disclosure, mandatory or on a comply or explain basis, depending on the type of organization, and soft targets, and a culture that facilitates an equal and fair working environment is the best approach. Disclosure on its own is, of course, not sufficient, but it provides information and it can have an impact on the reputation of a company. It is, however, only one mechanism to protect stakeholders and ensure better diversity. So I think for me, when we talk about regulation in the context of board diversity, and the same even if we talk about stakeholders more generally and the protection of stakeholders and to ensure sustainable companies, it is not just about regulation, yes or no, and it's not just to pick one specific way to deal with it, but it's really almost a selection of various mechanisms in that context. So for me, to ignore the role of regulation, especially disclosure and soft targets, to ignore the role that regulation, especially disclosure and soft targets, can play is not desirable, as that takes us to the position before reports like the Alexander Hampton report, for instance, when numbers were much lower than after the soft law targets were introduced. It is true that this is mainly at non-executive level, and this is where the culture, so think about internal behaviors, the values of the organization, structures and policies in place should come in, and where recruitment processes can play an important role too. And I think that is in line with what you've said during your presentation as well. So then the definition of diversity, as explained in the Corporate Governance Code, is also very valuable, as it broadly defines and promotes diversity of gender, social and ethnic backgrounds, cognitive and personal strengths. And it does not merely focus on gender diversity per se. So I agree with you that I think in the Corporate Governance Code in the UK, that is definitely a plus point. It is, of course, hard to define and measure culture, and that is why the regulatory option, disclosure, quotas, I suppose, are easier in a way than focusing a lot on culture. It is much easier to set targets or have disclosure obligations in place, as it is quantifiable. This brings me to my second point that I mentioned before, the focus on corporate culture. So I see this as potentially three layers in a way. Your first layer is your structure or governance and management layer. Then you have almost culture sitting in the middle, and then you have agency or individual agency, if you want. So culture sits in the middle, as it is not a control mechanism, as is the case with regulation sitting at the top. It is a more residual, almost like a variable between management and individual agency. Culture can therefore play a role on a voluntary basis, but it is not the best approach to solely rely on culture for a systematic approach. For that, you need to think about regulation and its potential scope in order to drive the diversity, equality, and fairness agenda. Then, with regards to the third point that I mentioned at the start, independence, and this links to other ways to address diversity on board level. I think it is uncontested that board composition should be reflective of society, but without merely ticking boxes and without tokenism or window dressing, as we've mentioned numerous times today already. However, even in countries with a high percentage of women sitting on boards, it is still mainly in non-executive capacity, as mentioned before. And I think that independence is important in this context. It is usually the case that independent boards, those with a high proportion of members who are independent of the company, generally make better decisions. Evidence supporting that proposition, especially in the US, where the tradition of independent directors was longer established, was already available in the 1990s and has generally remained influential, even if not conclusive. Questions, however, remain as to the effectiveness of non-executive directors, especially with regards to their independence and the monitoring functions they provide. So recent scandals have reinforced the impression that the presence of independent non-executive directors may be a necessary but not sufficient condition for good corporate governance. Independence on its own is therefore not sufficient. It has to be linked to the composition and diversity of the board more generally, as well as the role of shareholders and stewardship more broadly. So once again, not just focusing on one mechanism, if you like, to deal with the issue. Research indicates that there is an expectations gap between what individual or independent, really, non-executive directors think their role entails and how institutional shareholders view it, especially with regards to monitoring. A report on what makes an exceptional independent non-executive director was produced in 2012, listing the core characteristics of an independent non-executive director as independence, courage, integrity, being challenging but supportive, thoughtful communication, and a breadth of experience. The report concludes by stating that the ever-growing demands of responsible governance have resulted in a change in the role of independent non-executive directors who need to be more engaged, technically competent, and numerate. So independence can potentially prevent groupthink, protect stakeholders, prevent fraud, and ensure risks are properly analyzed. And these same arguments are also often made in the context of gender diverse boards. It is often argued that diverse boards will ensure better governance. But diversity is not just about gender diversity. It relates to diversity in skill sets, background, and experience. Then finally, with regards to my fourth point, the disclosure requirements, as well as the soft targets, are aimed usually at public and listed companies, well, at least in the UK. The question that one needs to ask here is whether this should also address diversity issues in startups and private companies, which make up a much larger percentage of UK organizations, in numbers at least, ignoring economic significance for now. The focus is on listed entities for various reasons, but mainly due to the public interest. Is this then less prevalent with private organizations? It is interesting to note that the same level, at least with startup companies, of gender diversity are not seen in private entities. This is worthwhile to consider if one thinks about the various regulatory options versus more firm-specific solutions, focusing on corporate culture, for instance. Does this indicate that the latter, in other words, firm-specific solutions and corporate culture, is perhaps not working on its own, in other words, where regulation is absent? So to conclude, gender diversity in UK boardrooms is lagging behind European counterparts, as well as New Zealand and South Africa, with only 30.1% of company seats held by women in the UK, according to a new global report by Deloitte. Women in the Boardroom, a Global Perspective. Despite growth in the last 10 years, much more work is indeed needed. This should, I believe, be in the form of a range of mechanisms, including regulation, so soft targets and disclosure requirements, but also an emphasis in corporate culture and internal firm policies and practices encouraging the diversity agenda. But other corporate governance aspects can also be useful in this context, like shareholder activism, how shareholders vote, a clear role for the nomination committee dealing with this through their board charter, for instance, or on a more practical level, allocating the issue of diversity, widely defined, to an individual director and make sure to use recruitment agencies that keep this in mind when recruiting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ari Marie, for your comments. I have to say that I'm rather inclined towards seeing some of the benefits that regulation has brought about as well, though I recognize that some measures can be cruder than others and very one size fits all. And this problem with listed companies getting most of these obligations while we feel that it's disproportionate to impose on smaller companies, but this problem does persist in the small business sector is an issue that is worth investigating. I'm just wondering if Akshaya would like to respond to any of Ari Marie's comments, as we hope the questions and comments from the audience might come in. I don't see any open questions yet, but I hope that you'll be interested to ask and engage with our speakers, and please do feel free to use the Q&A function. Akshaya?
Thanks, Iris. Thanks, Irene Marie, for taking time to read beyond chapter 4 and comment so insightfully on the issues I've raised. I really like the point about independence being linked to diversity. And I think in around chapter 2, I talk a little about how it starts to look like the arguments we're making for diverse in that in those earlier studies, gender diversity is what we would expect of independent directors. To an extent, I kind of caution that don't have that kind of expectation from diverse candidates. Don't expect them to come and wave a magic wand that other independent directors didn't do, but they definitely bring those independent perspectives, which in chapter 5, where I talk about culture, small part of that chapter, I talk about board culture, where it's important to not just hire diverse people, but to make sure you have the board chair or whoever, as Irene Marie said, if you assign one director to focus on diversity. I didn't write that, but that sounds like a good idea as well. But in chapter 5, I talk about how the board chair should actually bring out views of diverse candidates, because often they're not heard out at all, or if it's something against what everyone is saying, many times if it's just one view that's different, they tend to self-censor and not make it, because they're newer on the board and that board culture is not encouraging different views. So I like Erica Beecher-Moniz, Professor Beecher-Moniz article, where she talks about psychological independence. So you want directors with psychological independence, because you not only have different perspectives to offer, but you need to be psychologically independent from the CEO and majority of directors to say that, look, there is this other thing that we need to consider. Just, I think that was that. And there was another thing I wanted to get to about startups and smaller companies. I I did think about this while writing about why we focused on the bigger companies and not the smaller companies. But at the same time, there are also stories about how you have startups that I think I saw most recently in Brazil, a woman entrepreneur only hired women. So it was essentially wanting to kind of correct the market problem and hire women. So if we have these sort of laws, then we're also kind of stopping those sort of market solutions to the problem. So yeah, I struggle with this, but for startups specifically in Silicon Valley, because the California law and NASDAQ regulation mentioned that a number of tech startups, when they were listing, they went without a single diverse board director. There, I thought the problem isn't that you don't have representation on the board, but you don't have representation in the workforce. And that's why you have those cultural issues. So I guess with listening to Irene Marie, I was thinking, if you have solutions, top-down solutions regarding culture, which I haven't recommended, but if you do, then probably getting those to the smaller companies, private companies and startups is probably a good idea. But I'll stop there, and thank you again, Irene Marie.
Thank you.
Right, thank you both. I have two questions from the audience. I mean, the first is from Nicola Raihani, and very interesting question on whether corporate culture is something that follows from diversity, or is it something that allows diversity to flourish? And I think commenting on the relationship between the two, I mean, whether it's a chicken and egg problem or actually a circular problem, will be really interesting for us to investigate into whether anything top down, as you have both discussed and talked about. I mean, the idea that perhaps, if we have standards that relate to culture, that could work, or that could serve a purpose. And what are your views? Do you think that corporate culture is something that follows from diversity, or is it a precondition for diversity to flourish? Probably Akshaya first, and then I'll invite Irene Marie to also comment.
I actually don't think culture will improve just by having diversity. I've quoted some studies talking about how so these were, I think, interviews talking about how we expect, if there is a minority group, whether it is women or a racial minority, we expect that, okay, you have a few of these on the board, they'll encourage and appoint more at the management level. But we don't realize that many times there are intra-group conflicts that actually happen because they tend to be, if you just have two women, they tend to be pitted against each other. And this happens across whichever minority group. So many times in reality, they're not as supportive of each other as you would expect, just because of how the culture is within the firm. So I think culture should come first, or culture should consciously be worked on. Diversity alone can't solve that.
Right, thank you. Ari Marie, would you like to contribute to that as well?
Yes. Oh, apologies for that. Yes, I think maybe a good way to, I agree with what we said. I think culture, it's more the latter in the question. So you need to have culture first. Perhaps it's quite interesting here to refer to the report on corporate culture that's been issued a while back by the FRC, and they've recently issued a new one linking culture specifically to ESG. But their original report on corporate culture, they basically, as far as I can remember, they put culture in the middle, and then they link it to various issues, sort of, circles on the side, on the outside, and they specifically refer to purpose, values, strategy, the business model, and behaviors. So culture definitely being the starting point, and that's where you need to try to focus on. So I think that is quite a good way to look at it. So I think you need a proper corporate culture, and then hopefully diversity will follow from that as part of your values and your strategy in a sense. And maybe, Iris, if I can just add something here while I'm unmuted, and take the opportunity about something that's also been said by Akshaya on the startups, and maybe just something interesting to consider in that context, because I've been thinking quite a bit about that, because most of obviously the corporate governance code in the UK is for listed companies, and some of that, on the comply or explain basis, and some of that is then mandatory through the listing requirements. But in some other jurisdictions, they followed a different approach, where initially in South Africa, the King report, for instance, was originally in the 1990s also comply or explain, but it changed quite a bit over time. And the latest King 4 report actually works on a apply and explain basis, and it applies to all organizations. But of course, that cannot work on a comply or explain basis. It will be too difficult. But by using this concept of apply and explain, you have principles, maybe only, I think there's only 17 principles that all organizations have to apply. For instance, it will be very broadly defined, like you need to have an ethical board. Now, of course, everyone will apply that, we will hope. The and explain part, you can then adapt that for your organization, and that's the practices where you will get the details. For instance, you need to have a separate CEO and chair. And if that is something that is not applicable to your organization, you simply just state that. You don't have to have very long explanations. So that is one way to deal with diversity across a broader range, I suppose, of organizations. But I mean, I don't know, I'm not saying it's necessarily solving that problem, but that is maybe perhaps a different way to also look at that. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Ari Marie. I have a question, a very interesting question from a member of our audience. She has taken time out to have children and is currently working full-time while studying for her degree in the evenings. And she's looking at tips for younger women to have the confidence to be noticed and to be considered for more senior positions, and is wondering if both of you would have any tips in that regard. And I think one thing linked to that question would be really how corporations adapt to and cope with basically women's needs in relation to caring and relation to childbearing and taking time out for the family, and how corporations are coping with that better and not hindering women's career opportunities where this is concerned. Just wondering if the both of you would like to comment on that. Akshaya?
Thank you. That's a good question. And I think the way I've got to that flexible work and issues to deal with women's needs specifically is by looking at what we've had now in the face of the pandemic. Everybody was out of office, so everybody managed to work remotely. But in the past, when it was just having to adapt or having to adjust to a few or make adjustments for a few women, then corporations or management seem to think that this doesn't quite work. So now in a post-pandemic world, I think the best way to make the case is, everybody has done this really well in the pandemic, and I think we can follow similar learnings now to accommodate my needs. And also I would add just about Irene Marie mentioned networking earlier. Just in terms of how people get to higher positions through, everywhere you need someone to champion you, to open doors for you, no matter which sector it is. And I think one of the things many corporations are doing wrong is in the mentoring programs, they often assign women mentors for women, colored mentors for colored candidates. It doesn't help very much, because you need to actually make networks beyond your own whatever category they put you into. So I think just approaching whomever you think is someone that you would like to follow their path, and try and just ask that. It doesn't have to be a formal mentoring program, but you can informally seek out your own mentors. And yeah, I think that would be some of the real world advice. Just one more thing is if you have a different view and think you shouldn't actually make that view and offer that different perspective, I looked at some psychology studies, especially this book by Professor Vanessa Bones, where she talks about how even one person expressing a different view, even if the rest of the group is not really willing to hear another view, that different view makes them think and makes them have to clarify and answer the question of why that view will not work. So I think it's not a bad thing to just try, and it may just be an idea everyone likes.
Right, thank you. Irene Marie?
Yes, maybe just a few brief comments there. And firstly, I have to say, this is obviously not the questions we usually get on an academic webinar. So it's great to see that the discussion of how we want to deal with diversity in the real world, it actually results in these types of more practical questions. So maybe just from my own experience, looking at this as an academic, so how we at the university, for example, try to support younger academics, early career people who've taken a break from their career for whatever reason. There's various programs and support available at the university. And I think most of these support mechanisms work quite well. And as an employee, it's something that you can perhaps take up with the senior management if you don't have these type of programs already in place. Like you've mentioned, mentoring, setting your objectives with your mentor to make sure there's clear timelines. What do they expect from you? By when do they want that to be in place? To talk about adjustment of workload. If you study, for instance, that at the start, say first at the university, for instance, we get adjustment of your workload if you have to do certain additional training first. Also talk about flexible hours and those type of things. So I think as a first starting point, if you don't have these things already in place, to discuss that openly with your manager. But then also outside your actual employment, there's a lot of organizations supporting women with this. And in Scotland, I'm aware of, I think it's called Women Returners, and they offer a lot of advice. They have a lot of events that you can attend, of actually what type of questions should you ask, how, the practical things. They also have programs in place to help you with that. So I think there's a lot of support available there, definitely much more than at least 5 or even 10 years ago. So for me, that would be the sort of practical way to address this.
Thank you, Irene Marie. Question from one of our colleagues, Katazina. I think she's directing this question mainly to Akshaya. In terms of wanting to hear more about diversity on boards in the Indian context, I think it would be probably about whether or not you think that achievements have been made in relation to this area in the Indian context, or perhaps not, and what your views are on this. Akshaya?
Thank you. So I've looked a lot at this issue in India, although I haven't put it in the book. But like I said earlier, when I was talking about how the quota spread from Norway, it seemed like an attractive thing for India to pick up. And we had this quota saying that you need to have at least one woman director on the board of all public companies. Now, the response to that, because India has a number of family owned firms, or at least family dominated controlling groups in firms, the response was usually a family member of the controlling group getting appointed. So the point about independence really is totally lost if you do that. But even in terms of access, we aren't giving any new other women outside of the networks access. But the market regulator in India corrected that and said now for listed companies, the one woman director requirement would be changed a little. The woman director should also be an independent director. And I think that's a positive step, because although everything I've said about not liking quotas because of the costs, and becomes more enhanced when it's just one woman director. So it's more and more likely to be tokenistic, or at least viewed as a token. But I think it's still within that problem. I think we've made gains by saying that they have to be an independent director.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Akshaya. If you don't mind, I might abuse chair's privilege to ask a couple of questions, because this is an area that I'm really interested in. I haven't written much on this, but diversity on corporate boards is not only an issue that society perceives, but I think investors are also interested in it, as well as a whole wide range of stakeholders. But I'm just wondering, in terms of Akshaya's book, what areas or types of diversity are you covering? I mean, I'm just wondering whether you could give us, a fuller range of insights as to what types of diversity you're covering. And there is a very interesting blog post I read on the Oxford Business Law blog not long ago about empirical research done in the US in relation to the lack of diversity in one particular area, and that is political views, that the political leanings of many listed companies in the US are majorly Republican, actually. And that area, I mean, that sort of leaning can promote much more groupthink than maybe any other form of diversity. So in other words, for example, I mean, men and women on the board who share the same leanings may not be very different. And you might have men on the board divided by their political leanings who could be more constructively challenging vis-a-vis each other. I'm just wondering whether you think this sort of diversity is actually important and rather neglected, and whether there are any other sorts of diversity you think may be more neglected than perhaps gender diversity, which is probably the hottest topic in diversity that we always talk about. Both of you, I would love your comments. Probably Akshaya first.
Thanks, Iris. Yeah, in the book, I talk about, so I call it viewpoint diversity. And within that viewpoint diversity, I say that in the US, that's largely about political leanings. And in the UK, that's broader. And the idea is the word used is cognitive diversity. So I think when it's about political viewpoints, in as much as it makes a difference to the company, and in also the company culture, not just their operational decisions, it's important. I give some examples like I don't know if audience is familiar with the James Damore incident, where an employee of Google, Damore, he said that Google has it's become like a I forget what his exact words were, like an echo chamber, whatever. And he's specifically talking about political leanings. And I think more than having diversity on the board can help, but because I'm talking about culture as well, you can't have every type of diversity represented on the board, but in the diversity policy or diversity understanding of the company, it's better if it's written down. It's good if there's a commitment to tolerate different views, but I think in terms of operational decision making, it's good to have that political diversity on the board as well. I do talk about different things like experience, age, etc. Just to the extent where I'm describing what facets of diversity exist and how it can help at various levels. But when I get into the different aspects like social movements, culture, because not so much culture. In culture, I do talk about different viewpoints and cognitive diversity. But otherwise, because a lot of social movements have focused on race and gender, I've just focused on that. But one beyond political viewpoints, one useful thing is if there are people with different views, you could also have just different ideas popping up for the firm to move beyond whatever groupthink they're caught up in. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Ari Marie?
Yes, Iris, that's a great question, and I think very important, and it goes back to sort of the definition of diversity for me as well. But perhaps maybe to go one step back is the question that we should ask, should it not be, what is our goal with diversity? What do we want to achieve by having a diverse board? And I think we will all agree that the ultimate goal or sort of aim is to have different views on the board and to make sure that you don't just have, to prevent groupthink and all those wonderful things we talk about, all the time in the context of diversity. But of course, the focus has been on gender diversity and perhaps race and age, because it's much easier to address that. It's much easier to ensure you have a gender diverse or even age or race diverse board than it is to ensure that you have a politically diverse board. It's much harder to do that. And for me also, if you look at it, we are saying we want a gender diverse board, so we want to ensure female and male representation on the board, but often they might actually not have such different views on a lot of things. They might come from the same universities, they might have come from the same areas, they might have the same background. Now, there's counter arguments here, quite, very stereotyping in a way, saying that women might be more, emotional, more aware of, certain things, that men are more, are different in other ways. But there's no really, I suppose, any empirical proof or anything for that. So for me, the main thing would be, what is our aim? Why do we want diverse boards, and try to address that? But I think the more tricky part is to ensure that we are truly diverse and not just diverse with regards to age, race, or gender. And how to do that, I don't know how you actually ensure that, and to make sure that you have people from, with different, you would have thought you will always have people with different political views on a board. But if you look at that research that you are referring to, and I actually read that post as well on the Oxford blog, that I found really interesting, that it is obviously not the case there. And whether that is linked to gender is perhaps a different question altogether as well.
Thank you for your thoughts, Ari Marie. We are quickly coming to the end of our event, but we do have a very interesting question, rather provocative one as well, which I would like to field, and that is question by Keshav, who says that much of the narrative on gender diversity focuses on women's representation, and this is not a wrong thing, but it may be that there is an overcorrecting trend now, and he quotes certain statistics showing that university graduates appear to be roughly 60% females, and the law school's gender population seems to be in about that sort of ballpark as well. So do you think that there is an overcorrecting tendency with championing gender diversity? Anyone?
Yes, I don't know if, Akshaya, if you want to go first.
Oh, I think the overcorrection that they're talking about is probably at the lower levels of education, also lower levels of the workforce. It's not happening so much at the top, but also the quick funny story of how in France the mayor appointed, I think this is not about the corporate sector, but in the public sector, there was similar gender neutral quota, and the mayor appointed, I think, 60% women in positions. So she actually had to pay a fine because men were not represented, and there was a lot of outrage about that. And the reason for that outrage is because generally in those leadership positions, you don't have enough women. So I think it's not yet, we aren't at the overcorrecting phase, I would think.
Yes, maybe just one sentence to add there is, I agree. I think we, at non-executive director level, we are getting there and we are close to correcting it, but it's the executive and senior management level where we still have a lot of work to do. And I think the latest reports in the UK are definitely focusing more on that rather than the non-executive level.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much both for your comments and your enthusiastic answers to all of our questions. And thank you very much, audience, for participating in this and fielding us with so many thought-provoking questions. In this case, before I close the event, I will take the opportunity to thank both Akshaya and Irene Marie for your very scintillating presentations and thoughts, and hope that as we continue the conversations, we'll be able to see more measures as well as more thought about how to improve corporate culture more broadly and not just diversity, with diversity being something that is addressed as part of healthy and salutary corporate culture. Thank you very much to all of you, and we look forward to seeing more of you at our future events at the UCL Centre for Ethics and Law. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.